Welcome to Dividing Lines, a series of special programs from the Near Futurist, where we will be bringing together respected innovators and thinkers to examine some of the most consequential debates in technology and society today. Dividing Lines is powered by Diffusion, an award-winning international PR agency on a mission to help tech innovators to take on the status quo and transform the future faster. My name is Guy Clapperton. And if you wanted to feedback on the podcast or maybe even suggest ideas for guests and topics, I'd love to meet you in the shiny LinkedIn group I set up. Just search for my name and Near Futurist on LinkedIn and you'll find it pretty easily. Now, I have a particular interest in the topic of this edition. First, I've been a home worker since going freelance in 1993, which, for the mathematically challenged, is almost 3 decades ago. Second, in 2014, I was co-writer of a book called The Smarter Working Manifesto that covered what we would now call flexible working. So, as you can imagine, I was well placed to adapt during the pandemic, but this was entirely different from working from home voluntarily, and recently, the gloss of working from home has started to fall off for a lot of people. Now, it's tempting to blame Elon Musk for dictating that all Twitter employees must now work from the office, or Lord Alan Sugar for tweeting about what a bunch of Skyvers home workers are, for the fact that it's become so controversial. However, it was an issue before then, so in this debate, I have 2 guests who take nuanced but non-aligned views. In the pro-working from the office corner, we have Professor Christoph Siemroth, a microeconomist and associate professor at the University of Essex. And broadly, in the pro-flexible working corner, its returning guest, Dr. Nicola Millard, principal innovation partner for BT Digital Solutions. Welcome to both of you.
Thank you very much, Guy. Good to be here again.
Thank you.
Excellent. Well, perhaps we could start off with the basics. Christoph, I've drawn a terribly crude picture of your view on office-based working. Could you tell us a bit more about what you actually think?
So I would like to start just to fix ideas. I think there are 2 extremes. There's on the one hand, work from the office, which most firms did before the pandemic. All the employees were expected to come to the office in the morning and leave in the evening. And then the other extreme, which basically happened at the beginning of the pandemic, was everybody was working from home. And so in between, flexible working could be somewhere in between, but these are sort of the 2 extremes we could contrast. And so at the start of the pandemic, I think a lot of people, and especially a lot of firms, asked, are employees more or less productive working from home? And this question became even more important after the pandemic, after the vaccines were introduced, and then people were talking about, could we bring employees back? And productivity is an important concept for economists. And just for the record, it's defined as how much output is being generated by the employee per unit of time. And, because the day has 24 hours and the working day has roughly 8 hours, we usually think of time as being fixed. And so the only way that we can generate more output or more welfare is basically by becoming more productive. And so that's why productivity is important. And it's also important to ask, are people more productive, or employees more productive when they work from home compared to when they work from the office? And my conclusion from the economic literature at the moment is that for some simpler jobs, work from home can in fact improve productivity. So it's a good thing, but this doesn't apply to all jobs. And in fact, our own research has basically shown that for more complex and for team-based jobs, work from home can actually decrease productivity. So employees get less done when they work.
Okay, so this is all about economics, is it? Because a lot of people are talking about things like quality of life and more time with the family. Is that because you're an economist? It's not part of your professional view, or what is your perspective on that?
It is correct. We're first and foremost looking at how much value do employees generate for the firm. The thing is, when we looked at the research and looked at how well people are working from home, let me maybe briefly explain what the study did. So we looked at a large IT firm, and we were able to follow employees before the pandemic when they were all working from the office, and some analytics software in the background basically was tracking how long they were working and how much they got done. And then, of course, the pandemic started and they all worked from home, and that same software tracked how long they were working every day and how much they got done. And what we found is indeed that for these IT workers, these are mostly programmers who work in large teams, and they have to coordinate so that they can keep those corporate products in shape. productivity for these employees decreased by about 15%. So in other words, in a given hour of work, they got 15% less done. Why was that? What we found is that if we look at it the entire month, the employees actually still reach their goals. It's just that they had to work per day a bit more than an hour longer to actually reach their goals. And now you can phrase it like I do as, productivity drop, but you mentioned, work-life balance and so on. The other way of looking at it is that, well, if employees in these jobs, when they work from home, if they want to keep reaching their goals, well, then they have to work longer. And that is obviously also something that's not so great for work-life balance. So it is not at all clear that these things are going in opposite directions. When I say that, work from home can decrease productivity, it also could mean that it might also decrease time that is left for other things in life, which hopefully improve well-being and mental health and so on.
This is making a lot of sense to me. I'm just wondering, were these figures entirely from the pandemic year or years? Because I would imagine that the pressure of suddenly having to face the fact there's an international pandemic out there would also have an impact on productivity.
That's a good point. So what we compared is basically about 2 years before the pandemic and then about the first half year of work from the office. Of course, we use, fancy statistical methods and so on in order to get rid of the effects of other things. The pandemic worked in stages. There were different waves. And the effects we find were really due to the work from home and not so much due to, during some months, things were restricted more, whereas during other months, it was less restrictive due to how the pandemic was going. So we could really isolate it based on the work from home effect and not so much on the pandemic effect.
Thank you for clarifying that. Nicola, I don't imagine this sounds completely unreasonable to you. It certainly doesn't to me, but it's not down to me to put words into your mouth. Where would you actually differ on what Christoph just said?
I think a lot of the discussion actually that we've been having has been about the work itself rather than where the work goes on, because actually it's the work that's important. And I think if you can figure out where work is done, who's doing the work and the dynamics of the team that potentially they're in, actually where they should work probably should drop out at the bottom. So I kind of preface it by saying I think we're having probably slightly the wrong discussion because I think a lot of the stuff that I'm doing, certainly about the future of work, is trying to understand how we can make work better, for sure, for productivity, because that's one very big thing, but also for people and also for the planet. On the productivity stuff, I think, again, it comes down to who's doing the work and what work are they doing, because generally, for example, the studies that Nick Bloom has been doing over at Stanford is showing that generally work from home can increase productivity by about 5% on the research that they've done. Also, there's the other sort of proposition around why employees want to have the job in the first place, other than obviously the salary. Certainly, Nick's research has shown that employees value work from home about the same as a 5% pay rise. So actually salary could be kind of, I guess, traded a little bit for flexibility. Also, I mean, I think more widely and strategically, employers are having to think really carefully, because in many industries there are skills shortages. We're going to see how the global recession impacts on this. But if you ask people what they're looking for in a job, frequently they will say flexibility. And that does not mean 5 days at home. Neither does it mean 5 days in the office. Probably it's somewhere in between. But actually, they want a choice as to where, when, and how they work. And a lot of that's down to autonomy. A lot of that's down to things like trust. But that's the number one thing that employees are saying, certainly in our research. We've seen that. So I know LinkedIn also published some research saying that if you advertise the job with some kind of hybridity or flexibility in the job description, you're 40% more likely to get people applying for those jobs. So I think, above and beyond productivity, and I think that's a discussion as to what you are doing, because certainly the stuff that we've done and that many other research projects, including the Nick Bloom stuff, is showing that people are feeling as if they are more productive if they are able to work in a much more flexible way. And not everyone is either. So frequently the ones that are the privileged ones that can work from home or work from an office or work somewhere in between are knowledge workers. And actually that throws up a big question around the productivity stuff we've been talking about. So you can measure how many lines of code an IT person has produced. Similarly, contact centers, you can figure out how many calls they've taken and how efficient those calls were. But we're taking kind of a factory model, I guess, of productivity here. And most knowledge workers have a lot less tangible output. So I think even on productivity, people are feeling more productive, mainly because they're not having to commute. And I think it's the commute that no one has missed, not commuting. People are willing to do commutes, but maybe not 5 days a week because they feel as if they're not being productive, or at least they're sucking a lot of energy out of the day. But, I think that perception of productivity is quite key amongst knowledge workers who are largely incredibly difficult to measure. So, I think from the sort of people and productivity perspective that we're looking at, I think actually it's less about home working, it's less about office working, it's about offering choices within reason. So depending on the individual, depending on the task that they're doing, and depending on the team dynamics, to provide some flexibility as to where people work.
Do you want to sound as confident as my interviewee in this episode? If you talk to the press or other media, are you worried you'll be misquoted, or they'll just publish their story and not yours? Clapperton Media Associates can help with coaching. Drop me a note, guy@clapperton.co.uk, and we'll arrange a time for an exploratory call. Now, back to the podcast. The interesting thing to me is I was media training someone only last week who confessed to me that they thought people should work together and they should be in the office. However, they felt, because I was helping them with their messaging, etc., they felt they couldn't or shouldn't express that view out loud. I'm just wondering whether either of you, let's start with Nicola, have come across people feeling they shouldn't make declarations like that, just because the pendulum seems to have swung so far towards, let's call it, flexible working.
I don't know if I've kind of almost heard the opposite, because there's this thing around flex shaming that someone coined that phrase around if you were working in a flexible role, perhaps you were being bypassed for promotion, or you'll get a worse appraisal if you're not seen to be in the office. That's linked into a lot of the work that we've been doing around proximity biases, which are, of course, natural unconscious biases around how our tribal brain evolved to really kind of relate to people that we see on a very regular basis. And indeed, that is a case for the office. I think in terms of if you're looking at hybrid working, one of the big questions is what are offices for? And actually for collaboration, for communication, and for creating community, they are the kind of the gold standard. Now, we can do those things in other ways, as we found out during the pandemic. I think the discussion then is, okay, looking at the task, the people, and the context they're working in, is it absolutely necessarily that everyone has to go into an office, or can we do some of this remotely? I think also, if you're looking at tasks, so I know you're a writer, Guy. I do a fair amount of writing. Writing when you're in a noisy office is almost impossible. Certainly for me, I'm an introvert as well, so I like my own space, and I like being able to just sit back and think, to be perfectly honest. Now, I have to confess, I was never a home worker prior to the pandemic, but it's kind of been a bit of a revelation to me as to actually it's an environment I can adapt. That means that I can be very productive when I'm doing things like writing. But if I want to meet somebody for a cup of coffee, yeah, I'm probably going to go into the office to socialize and talk about work, bump into people, because that is kind of the gold standard. And all of the other digital options that we have, and to be frank, digital is probably our common ground here. They're not quite as good, but they are workable. And if given the choice between flying around the world to have a meeting with somebody or doing it virtually, I probably choose the latter now, for the sake of the planet as well as everything else.
You just reminded me of when I first went freelance. This would be about the mid-90s somewhere, I got asked if I could come and do a shift writing news for Computing magazine, which of course was a very busy office, everybody on the phone the whole time. And I spent the first half an hour, having been home working for a year or so, I spent the first half an hour sitting there waiting for a bit of hush until somebody came and asked me what the blazes I thought I was doing, just sitting there, because I just got so used to this quiet and typing. It's a different mindset. I wonder, though, is there a generational divide about this? I mean, Christoph, if we're talking about flexible working, but particularly with talking about home working, not everybody can afford a home. It's all very well for me as a middle-aged man to say I can work from home, but I have a home. I have my little home office. My wife can do the same. But, if I were perhaps not even particularly young, people in their early 30s are still living in shared houses or with their parents, it can be an issue, can't it?
Yes. That is one aspect. What are the home facilities? And it tends to be the case that the younger workers don't yet have that fancy home or that home office, and rather they're sharing or...
I didn't say it was fancy. I live near Croydon. I did not say it was fancy.
Fair enough.
Carry on.
Fair enough. And the other thing is, of course, young people might just have young kids. What happened during the pandemic is, of course, schools were closed every now and then. And then when you not only have... So you either have flatmates or you have kids around, and that, of course, doesn't make for a perfect work environment at home. Whereas, older workers where the kids are already out of the house, they might have an advantage there. But even apart from, home facilities, my impression, oddly enough, is that young employees or young graduates do value work from home more than older generations. But at the same time, it feels like these younger generations are actually kind of disadvantaged by it. The thing is, if you're just coming out of university and you need to get that on-the-job training, and maybe you graduated just before the pandemic and your job started in the first months of the pandemic where everybody's working from home, you just do not get the same onboarding that you would have gotten in person beforehand. So this learning on the job is just harder when you don't have senior colleagues around in the office. And in fact, our study did show that, for example, there was less one-on-one teaching during work from home. And we also saw that employees who had been with the company longer, they actually did manage better during the pandemic. And that was presumably because they already were familiar with, company processes and who to contact and how to do and which form to use. Whereas, people who just joined, they didn't have that knowledge, and it was harder to get it when they were working from home. Rather, in the office, you could have just quickly asked somebody, or somebody would give you the information in passing. So working from home, you're just not able to absorb this informal information as well as when you're in the office. I think that hits young people who are just coming from the university more.
Yes, and you do miss that sort of bumping into somebody in the corridor or something and having that informal chat that then opens up a new idea or something. Because although I don't denigrate the virtual world, I think it was probably a lifesaver for many people during the pandemic. I'd hate to think what would have happened if there'd been a pandemic without all this technology to help us. It does become very transactional. It does become a sort of, ask a question, get an answer, and the informal stuff is not quite as it was, regardless of the amount of pub quizzes we all attempted in the early days. We've already covered flexible working advertised as a benefit. Christoph, I wonder if you've come across those figures that Nicola was talking about earlier and could comment on them.
Yeah, so I do believe most employees value flexibility. I mean, in a very general way, if you look at it, perfect flexibility in a way can't make you worse off, right? Because if you prefer the office, you can go to the office. If you prefer to stay at home, you just do that. So in a way, what's the drawback? And yeah, it's true what Nicola mentioned. I also saw another study, a Harvard study, where they were also looking at employees, and some of those were in fact willing to work from home and for a lower wage than local on-site alternatives. So indeed, some employees are willing to forego a higher wage just to be able to work from home. And indeed, there are opportunities for win-win situations where the firm is sort of saving a bit of salary and the employee gets to work from home, which they prefer. So we shouldn't demonize, work from home or flexible working. But at the same time, we should be honest about sometimes innovation can suffer if you don't have these interactions that you can have in the office. Productivity can suffer. Nicola mentioned these call center studies. My position is that the productivity effects of work from home very much depend on the type of job you have. In a call center, the call center worker doesn't work in a team. They work alone. They call up people to sign them up for new contracts and new policies. You don't need to coordinate with your team. So in that sense, you might as well do it at home. And indeed, those studies show you can work better from home. This is mostly because, as you mentioned, these call centers are very noisy. But when we looked at these IT firms where you have large teams of programmers, no single programmer can take care of those large databases and so on. So they need to coordinate. And that is simply easier when you work from home, when you're all in the same room. And just based on the data we see, it does work better when they do it from the office.
Okay, I'm sure there are some contact centers where they do benefit from a bit of buzz and a bit of swapping ideas around. But I take what I do take your point. I do wonder, though, Nicola, home working is one thing, or flexible working is one thing, I should say, because you're quite right to point out this is not all just about the home. But managing people you can't see is another. We're talking about the people who are doing the work at the moment. We're talking about the foot soldiers, if you like. But how do you adapt to manage people you can't see?
Well, that is the big challenge. I think management have been placed in the spotlight very firmly throughout the pandemic, to be perfectly honest. And we actually did, as part of our research, interviews with, oddly enough, contact center managers. And I would also say contact center jobs are quite stressful. So that's another reason why sometimes managing when you can't see tears is a very big challenge in that particular scenario. But it's quite interesting that managers, particularly during the first few months of the pandemic, actually wanted people back in the office as soon as possible, frankly, because that sort of duty of care they felt they needed to be able to manage by walking around and see people, not because they didn't trust them, but simply to make sure that they're okay. And I think they got a crash course in managing remote teams, didn't they, throughout the pandemic? And most of them, to be honest, rose to that occasion really, really well. I think doing interviews a year on, we then got a lot of anxieties around, well, okay, so we know how to manage remote teams now. We know how to manage fully co-located teams. What we don't know is how to manage a hybrid team. And again, those proximity biases were one very big thing. If they're co-located with their team, are they giving them preferential treatment? I always say managing by walking around is a very, it's a long taught management trope, isn't it? How do you do that when you're zooming around? Obviously, other platforms are available, but it's a big challenge for leaders, I think. And to Christoph's point about things like, younger people, they don't necessarily have the social networks at work, and I mean sort of connections between people rather than Facebook, but or in their case probably TikTok. But those things, those networks are really valuable. Now, you can build networks digitally. I think one of the things that we're seeing, certainly for future leadership and future employees generally, is actually our ability to network is really important, particularly as we are moving. I think hybrid is going to be the model, that we're not going to all be co-located. We're not all going to be at home. There is going to be a big mix. So that ability to network is a really, really key skill. Now, firstly, for leaders, they need to be able to connect people together. I call them perfect party hosts. So you need a purpose, you need a platform, and you need to be able to be very good at introducing people who are potentially those serendipitous encounters. How do you do those actually intentionally? So it can't just be bumping into people in a corridor. It needs to be, hey, you should be talking to them because they've got an interesting perspective that might be really interesting for you. So leaders need to be perfect party hosts, but I think equally so do employees in a hybrid situation as well. I guess there's good news and bad news on this. To be honest, most people are very bad at networking. I would include myself in this. The good news is it's a skill. So certainly we've been discussing, whether we start building networking as a skill into things like graduate programs or apprenticeship programs, because there are future leaders. That's one of the key skills that they're going to need in order to rise up and be incredible leaders of the future. So yeah, I think that there's a lot of focus on management. I think certainly, hybrid working disrupts a lot of the conventional management models. It's very easy for managers to say, hey, I want everyone back, because it makes their job a lot easier. Doesn't necessarily mean that their employees are going to say yes and run back to the office, as I believe Elon Musk may have found out as well.
Well, so far he has, but something I'm interested in, I'd like to use this as a sort of closing thought before I ask you for both the contact details, is, of course, this winter of all winters, we're going to have a cold snap, and we have the cost of living crisis. Heating's going up an absolute by degrees, it's going. Sorry, heating in degrees. Bad joke in there. But the costs are going to be astronomical. The thing about home working is that you do have to pay for your own heating. I'm wondering if you're anticipating that that'll have any effect. Perhaps Nicola, you could start us off.
We've certainly seen that, before the pandemic, in particularly hot countries like Singapore, where people have to cool their houses. We did see that that potentially they would want to come back in the office. There are a lot of other cultural drivers there, but I think what we're finding at the moment is that people are becoming quite savvy around the cost of commute versus cost of heating. So if you've got an expensive season ticket into London that you're paying, actually you may be paying an awful lot more than you would if you stayed at home and heated your house. So I think that's the first thing. I think the second thing is home working is always regarded as a green option. But as you said, actually, there have been some studies showing that it's probably the worst one for the climate, hybrid, because you're heating, lighting, cooling houses, heating, lighting, cooling offices, and you have some level of commuting in between as well. So that there are all sorts of things to take into account. So, I mean, you can look at certainly, obviously making offices much more carbon neutral, potentially looking at incentivizing or putting stipends in for home workers to either incentivize them to go for greener energy options, not necessarily cheaper at the moment, but of course, good for the environment, or, indeed give them money towards their heating, lighting costs. And then the commute, I think, is an interesting one around, can you start to get a lot of the co-working discussions at the moment are around, well, rather than having a 2-hour commute into an urban location, if you don't want to work from home, is there another, cyclable or walkable option that's on a high street or somewhere near you? Or indeed, if you look at some of the stuff that's going on by the Irish government and their rural working manifesto, could you nip down to the local pub to work for the day? The poffice, as I like to call that one. My preference is the coffice because I run on coffee. But there are lots of options that we need to think about when we obviously have an energy crisis, but frankly, we also have an allied climate crisis, and we do need to think about the planet as well.
Point taken. Christoph, any perspectives on that?
So I agree. The trade-off is commuting is very costly. So it's not clear whether work from home is cheaper or actually going to the office is cheaper. Another thing is that if we think more long-term, the possibility of work from home or flexible working might actually affect where you live. So it used to be that if you're required to be in the office every day, you might live closer to city centers, which might have higher house prices, higher rents, but then also a shorter commute. But now if you don't have to commute every day, you might just decide to live elsewhere so that you can actually save on rent, for example. And then if we think this even further ahead, firms might react to this and say, okay, if our remote workers live in an area that is cheaper because of rents or because, if you live outside of London, all sorts of other costs are lower. Maybe we pay our remote workers less because they have lower costs. Isn't that fair? So we might start to see some of that. And then, of course, some workers might actually prefer that, being allowed to work from home and then live maybe in the country closer to their parents or something like that. And apparently in the US, there are some firms which already do something like that. So I heard stories of some Silicon Valley firms who normally have to pay their employees a lot so that they can afford to live locally in San Francisco. But now during the pandemic, they were all working remotely. And then some of them moved maybe to another state, maybe into some village where rent prices are considerably lower. And so they did pay those remote workers less. And that might actually be a win-win situation. So there are some chances with respect to flexible working.
Okay, there are other counterexamples, I'm sure. I know one case where somebody got a job during the pandemic and they were in Brighton and the job was in London. They then decided to move to Birmingham and are now claiming that it's discriminatory to insist they come into the office one day a week when, of course, that was the deal. It was always going to be the deal, but the reality is slightly different. I think we could probably discuss this absolutely forever, but it's a fascinating topic. Thank you both for taking part. We are running out of time now. So finally, could you let me know where people can find out about you and what you do? Christoph?
So on the University of Essex website, you can find an overview of my research. And the study that I mentioned on work from home with my co-authors has a nice accessible summary on the University of Chicago website, and I can give you the link.
That's fabulous. I'll make sure that goes into the program notes. And Nicola?
I do occasionally blog on bt.com. We've got links to white papers there as well, but actually probably the best way to find out what I'm doing is to either link in with me, come on to Twitter if it still exists next week, or indeed I've just hopped onto Mastodon as well. So you can find me all over the place, basically.
That's great. Dr. Nicola Millard of BT and Professor Christoph Siemroth of the University of Essex, thank you.
Thank you.
And many thanks to you for listening. That was the Near Futurist podcast with me, Guy Clapperton, and my guest in the latest in the series of Dividing Lines, sponsored by Diffusion PR. Don't forget to have a look at the website at nearfuturist.co.uk, leave a review on iTunes, or come along and have a look at the LinkedIn group. I'll be back soon. This has been a Clapperton Media Associates production.